I had always been fascinated by the supernatural, drawn to the eerie stories and legends that surrounded my hometown. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience. It all started on a dark and stormy night, when my friends and I decided to explore the abandoned Hollow Hill Cemetery. It was said to be a place of great power, filled with the spirits of the dead who were unable to rest in peace. As we entered the cemetery, a chill ran down my spine. The wind howled and the trees swayed, creating an eerie atmosphere that sent shivers down my spine. My friends and I laughed nervously, trying to brush off the feeling of unease that hung in the air. But as we walked deeper into the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The tombstones seemed to loom over us, and the shadows danced around us, playing tricks on our minds. My friends and I decided to split up, each of us exploring a different part of the cemetery. I was drawn to a particular grave, an old and weathered stone with the name Evelyn etched onto it. As I approached, I heard a faint whisper on the wind, calling out my name. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. I turned around, but there was no one there. I brushed it off as my imagination, but as I continued to walk, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and I screamed, turning around to find no one there. But then I saw her, standing in front of me, Evelyn. She was a young girl, no more than 10 years old, with pale skin and dark hair. Her eyes were hollow and her dress was tattered, as if she had been buried for centuries. I was paralyzed with fear as she spoke to me, her voice barely audible. She told me of her tragic death, how she had been killed by her own father and buried in this cemetery. She had been waiting for someone to come, to help her find peace and put her spirit to rest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I knew I had to help her. I called out to my friends and they came running to my aid. But they couldn't see Evelyn, they thought I was going crazy. But then they heard her too. And as we stood there, listening to her story, the ground began to shake and the sky turned blood red. Evelyn's father had come to claim her once again, but this time we were not going to let him take her. My friends and I joined hands, forming a protective circle around Evelyn's grave. We chanted and prayed, using all the energy we had to banish the evil spirit. And finally, with a loud roar, Evelyn's father disappeared and the sky cleared. Evelyn's spirit was finally at peace, and the cemetery was no longer haunted. My friends and I left, shaken but victorious. From that day on, I never ventured into the Hollow Hill Cemetery again. But I knew that I had experienced something truly supernatural, and it would stay with me forever. I had always heard the legends of the Wailing Woman of Wicker Woods, but I never truly believed in them. As a child, it was just a scary story told around campfires or during sleepovers. But now, as I walked through the dark, eerie forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I was on a camping trip with my friends, and we had foolishly decided to explore Wicker Woods at night. We had heard rumors that the Wailing Woman only appeared at night, and being the thrill-seekers we were, we couldn't resist the temptation. As we walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to grow taller and closer together, blocking out most of the moonlight. The only source of light was our flashlights, which cast eerie shadows on the trees and the ground. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig had us on edge, but we laughed it off, trying to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination. But then we heard it, a chilling wail that seemed to come from all around us. It was a mournful sound, filled with pain and sorrow. My friends and I froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. I could see the fear in their eyes, and I knew that mine mirrored theirs. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the wailing, too scared to move. But then one of my friends, Tom, broke the silence and suggested we leave. We all agreed and turned to leave, but as we did, we saw her. The Wailing Woman stood before us, her long, tangled hair covering most of her face. She wore a tattered white dress, and her pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight. But what was most terrifying was her eyes. They were red and filled with a deep sadness that seemed to penetrate our souls. We screamed and ran as fast as we could, but it felt like we were running in slow motion. The Wailing Woman pursued us, her wails growing louder and more desperate. I could feel her breath on the back of my neck, and I knew she was getting closer. Just when I thought we were done for, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of it was a large wicker statue, and beside it was a small fire. Without thinking, we ran towards the statue, hoping it would offer us some kind of protection. As soon as we reached the statue, the wailing stopped, and the wailing woman disappeared into thin air. We were all trembling, trying to catch our breaths and make sense of what had just happened. But before we could even begin to process it, we heard a voice. "Leave this place and never return," the voice said. It seemed to come from the statue, and it was filled with a warning that sent shivers down our spines. We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our things and ran back to our campsite, not stopping until we were safely inside our tents. We never spoke of that night again, and we never returned to Wicker Woods. But even now, years later, I still hear her wails in my nightmares. And I know that the wailing woman of Wicker Woods is real, and she will always be there, waiting for her next victims to wander into her domain. As I walked down the deserted street, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The sky was dark and the wind was howling, creating an eerie atmosphere. I was on my way to meet some friends at a nearby cafe, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. As I turned the corner, I saw it, the abandoned orphanage. It had been there for years, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows shattered. The locals said that it was cursed, that strange things happened inside. I had always been fascinated by it, but I never had the courage to explore it. Until now, with my heart racing, I pushed open the rusty gate and stepped inside. The place was a mess, with broken furniture and debris scattered everywhere. The air was thick with dust, and I could hear the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the corridors. As I made my way through the orphanage, I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was following me. But every time I turned around, there was no one there. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper coming from one of the rooms. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should leave, but my curiosity got the best of me and I followed the sound. The room was empty, except for an old crib in the corner. As I approached it, the whispering grew louder and I could make out words. "Help me. Please. Help me." The voice sounded like that of a child. I looked around, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the crib started shaking violently and I stumbled back in fear. Without thinking, I ran out of the orphanage and didn't stop until I was back on the street. My friends were waiting for me at the cafe, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had just happened. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the shaking crib and the haunting voice kept playing in my mind. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go back and investigate. So, the next day, I returned to the orphanage. This time, I brought a flashlight with me. As I entered the room with the crib, I noticed something written on the wall in red paint. "They left us to die. Now we will never leave." The writing was accompanied by a drawing of a group of children. As I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I frantically tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard it, the sound of children's laughter and footsteps running towards me. I could feel their presence, but I couldn't see them. In a moment of panic, I remembered something from the local legend about the orphanage. It was said that the spirits of the abandoned children roamed the halls, seeking revenge on anyone who entered their home. I had to get out. With all my strength, I pushed against the door and it finally swung open. I ran out, not looking back until I was far away from that cursed place. From that day on, I never ventured near the abandoned orphanage again. But I could still hear the echoes of the children's laughter and cries for help, haunting me in my nightmares.